Rep Prox. Good morning, sir.
Morning. How are you this morning?
Well, I hear you got sunshine down there, so good for you.
Man, it was incredible. The whole town just changed overnight. It was great.
Yeah, there are a few things more beautiful in this world than South Central in the sunshine, or Southeast in the sunshine.
Yep.
Just gorgeous.
Yeah.
Well, all right, everybody. Good morning. It is Tuesday, April 20th. We are here at the Energy for Alaska Task Force meeting. If you'll recall, last week we had as our guest Mr. Ian Lang with the Institute of the North, here to advocate on behalf of a constitutional amendment to enshrine POMV, percent of market value payouts relative to the permanent fund, but silent on spending. Today, I think we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive in the options Alaska has to fill its budget. Again, right now, we're relying heavily on resource revenues, particularly oil still, though it's a much smaller part of the budget, but then investment earnings. But those are proving insufficient to meet all of the demands for spending. So let's have that thorny discussion, shall we? So our guest is Mr. Cliff Groh, former Special Assistant to Commissioner of the Department of Revenue, and here to help us or to guide us through that discussion. Cliff.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it and appreciate linking up with you folks in Fairbanks and also around the state. So I got a slideshow. We're going to go to it now. So here we go. So I really, as I said, appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. I've worked in this area, and I know it's sort of hard to believe looking at me because I look like a kid. I get that a lot. But I've actually worked in this area about 40 years. I was a legislative assistant back in 1982 who worked by far the most on the creation of the Permafend Dividend. I also worked as a special assistant to the Commissioner of Revenue in the Cooper administration, where I was heavily involved in oil tax policy and the passage of an oil tax bill. And I have also worked with the private civic groups as well in the years since then on this. And now this is pretty much all that I do is work on Alaska's fiscal crisis. So what I even did is last year I decided that I needed to branch out more. So I even published 3 books or booklets with the aid of Peter Dunlop Scholl, a very talented longtime cartoonist for the Anchorage Daily News. So here's a presentation that borrows a lot from the material in my books or booklets, which are all available for free at my website at www.cliffgroh.org. If you don't want to go to a website, you could even email me at cliff.groh@gmail.com, and I'd email you back. So let's just get into it. And I know what everybody wants on a Tuesday morning is a pop quiz. So let's go to that. And so we'll walk through this. What is the state of Alaska's largest revenue source? I've lived in Alaska all my life, always heard we're an oil state. So what is the way we finance our budget now in the unrestricted general fund, or UGF, which is how most people think of the budget? Permafund earnings to the tune of 65% this year, just about two out of every $3 of the UGF revenue, which is the way we normally think about the budget in Alaska, comes from Permafund earnings. How much has the UGF budget been cut in the last 8 years? There's a big hit right there. Notice I said cut. How much has it been cut in the last 8 years? Do I hear any guesses? 43%, according to the Alaska Legislative Finance Division, which are the state of Alaska's nonpartisan budget scorekeepers, nonpartisan budget scorekeepers. I want to say that again. The budget has been cut almost 43% in the last 8 years. Next question. Which state's residents, at all the 50 states in the United States, which state's residents have the lowest tax burden, counting both state and local taxes? Anybody have a guess on that?
We don't have a guess.
North Dakota.
Alaska by a lot. Alaska, but that counts both the state taxes and the local taxes. Alaskans pay the lowest taxes in the United States, and it's not close. So starting in 18 months, how much does Governor How much does Governor Dunleavy propose in additional revenues for our state? Other revenue sources, he calls it in his Office of Management budget, the latest version of this document. I'll tell you, it's $787 million the first year, more than $750 million the first year in FY23, and going forward to that, every year he seeks more money in additional budget, additional other revenue sources in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Although he has not stated where those revenues would come from.
Hey, Cliff.
So as I said, Cliff? Peter drew this. Yeah, Cliff? It's a little off here. Yeah.
Cliff, do you mind clicking there?
Yes.
At the top, do you mind clicking your view and going ahead and put it on full display mode?
Slide view.
Slide view.
I'm looking for
slideshow. Go to
slide view. I'm looking for.
It should either.
I'm looking for that. I'm trying to find it.
just up from where your cursor was.
I'm looking
at the top.
Okay.
Over to the left.
Go to slideshow where it says slideshow.
I do not see the word slideshow.
No.
I hear the word. Okay. How about, is this?
Oh, now just over to the left. Down on the bottom, you'll see it almost looks like a movie screen pulled down.
I often see it. Movie screen pulled down. Okay.
Over one more to the right. That's it.
Yes. Slideshow. Did we get it? Looks like we got it.
Aha! Yes, sir.
All right. Hooray. We're rolling now. Thank you, folks. So here's Peter's cartoon for this. I understand you've had heavy snow in Fairbanks this year. We've sure had a lot of heavy snow in Anchorage as well, and we're wrapped up. And we're in serious trouble. We need to act soon. Delay is the enemy. Every year we delay, the problem gets worse. So Alaska has had for about 35 years what I've called an oil money party that ran for about 35 years. It ended a number of years ago, although it's hard for some people to recognize that. And the oil money party, as I define it, would be that period of time that ran on for, as I said, 3.5 decades, where Alaska got so much oil money, new oil money each year, it was able to pay for almost all of the state spending through that. But several forces have come together to end the oil money party, and it happened several years ago. Two of them are shown on this graphic. The blue bars show Alaska oil production, which is now fallen by more than 3/4 since the peak in the late 1980s. We used to have more than 2 million barrels a day of oil go through that Trans-Alaska pipeline system. Now, just about 500,000 barrels a day goes through it. And you'll notice that it's not projected to get back to 600,000, right? That it's not going to dramatically, the last operation is projected not to get back to anywhere near what it was 10 years ago. Another factor is, of course, worldwide oil prices. And this gold line shows, or dark orange line, shows oil prices. And as you can see, they bounce around a lot, and they've had several peaks. But the latest peak is way lower than the previous peaks, and the oil prices are not expected to get back to the previous peaks if you look forward 8-9 years. And the basic problem is, in some sense, is that the oil prices aren't getting high enough to make up for the dramatically lower Alaska oil production. A third factor is that in 2014, the state of Alaska adopted an oil tax system that's substantially more subject to declines in oil prices. And so the upshot is oil is projected to generate only 25% of the state's unrestricted general fund revenue this year, this current fiscal year of 2021, when 7 years ago it represented 92%. So now let's actually go to revenues, and we'll start with a much longer time frame here. We'll start all the way back at statehood. These are oil revenues. And you can see it runs all the way to the current fiscal year, and then they're projected slightly forward.
Hey, Cliff.
And you can see that we had, yes, Jomo.
I see that we have one of our participants unmuted. Hey, Rich, did you have a question on the last slide?
This one?
All right. Sorry, sir. Carry on.
I'll keep going. Thank you, Jomo. And thanks again for your help in my slowness in getting the slide share. Glad it's working better. It's working better now. Going back to these oil revenues, you can see that for this state of Alaska, we had a giant increase when the pipeline opened up in 1977. And when it was above, and then we had some really big peaks. Around 2008, 2012, and then it's fallen just off a cliff. Not to make a pun, and hasn't come back. So I've been doing this a long time. I was doing these presentations in the 1990s. I found I wanted an overall graphic of Alaska's fiscal system, the way we spend money, the way we collect money, the way we save it, and nobody had done it. So I started freehanding it, and I'm a terrible artist. So in more recent years, including last year, I had Peter Dunlap Scholl, the cartoonist. He drew this last summer. So the numbers are slightly off, they're a little bit outdated there, but the flows are the same. So this is the Groh flow, folks. This shows the entire fiscal system in one graphic. Okay, let's start in the upper left-hand corner. Oil revenue, shown as in this oil barrel, brown oil barrel. Oil revenue in Alaska consists of both oil taxes and oil royalties. And the oil revenue mostly goes in the general fund, shown in the top middle. That's the state of Alaska's household account. And most of the money in the general fund is spent and goes either, all of it each year, goes either to public services, shown by Peter in the upper right-hand corner as an Alaska flag. He could have also drawn a teacher at a blackboard, because that's where a giant amount of the state's budget goes, is for local K through 12 education around the country. Could have shown, a University of Alaska Fairbanks building, or a state trooper, state social worker. Then on the lower right-hand corner is that unique Alaska, Alaska institution known as Permafend Dividends, which I helped create, like I said, on the lower right-hand. Then let's go back over the left-hand side of the graphic, and under a constitutional amendment the people of Alaska adopted in 1876, a portion of the oil revenues each year are deposited as a mandatory matter into the permanent fund, and a permanent principal is shown in the lower left-hand corner as a safe, because it takes another constitutional amendment, which would require a vote of the people to spend money out of the permanent fund principal, spend the permanent fund principal itself. The permanent fund principal does generate earnings, and those earnings flow into this permanent fund earnings reserve account, shown as a checkbook in the lower middle. And under a very substantial change that occurred, the Alaska legislature adopted in 2018, a law the Alaska legislature adopted called the Percent of Market Value, or POMV law, or statutes. The permanent fund earnings reserve account, for the first time starting that calendar year, 2018, sends very substantial amounts of money each year to the general fund, which then go out as spending for the state of Alaska on the right-hand side. Additionally, you'll see two other elements I'll explain briefly. One is there's a commercial fishing boat you'll see in the right middle. That Peter drew that when a commercial fishing boat, but he also could have drawn a bottle of alcohol, a pack of cigarettes, a joint of marijuana, because these are all things the state of Alaska taxes and gets revenues from that are not either oil money or money from investment earnings. That's a relatively small amount of money for the state, but more stable. Then in the middle on the left, you'll see a bank bag. It's shown as a bank bag because it is more protected under the law than the general fund from spending, but way less protected than the safe of the permanent fund principal. That's the Constitution Budget Reserve. And it's now under $1 billion, where it used to be well over $10 billion some years ago, because the state has spent an enormous amount of its savings to make the state's fiscal system work after the Alaska Oil Money Party ended. So since the end of the oil money party, we both spent our savings almost dry outside of the permanent fund, and we've cut spending heavily. As I said before, we cut it over the last 8 years by 43%. And our total budget reserves outside the permanent fund have fallen by more than 80% in the last 8 years.
Move that way, Jim.
Hello?
No, Jim was having me readjust the screen.
Got it. Thank you. So now we're going to go to spending. So this is the spending, and we're going to start with a time scale here. It starts in 1975, which is during pipeline construction, and that's before the big boom in spending occurred that occurred after the state started receiving giant amounts of money following the completion of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System in 1977. And so this graphic runs from 1975 to the current fiscal year, 2021. I want to note something else here, which is this graphic is adjusted for both population and inflation, because the population of Alaska, for those of us who were here in the 70s know, is way larger today than it was 30, 40 years ago. Additionally, this graphic also adjusts for inflation because things cost a lot more than they, or a dollar went, to put it another way, a dollar went a lot further in 1975 than it does today. So the first thing I want you to notice is it adjusted for inflation and population, the state is spending less than it did in the 1970s before the big oil boom started. And there's been a lot of variation over the years, but now we're below where we were before the start of the giant petro cycle, petrodollar recycling boom, as it's sometimes called. The other thing that I think it's important to know are the components of spending. And this graphic shows that as well. So the blue bars on the bottom are agency operations. Everything from the payments to highway road graders, to state troopers, to teachers, principals, to payments for the ferry workers. That's the blue bar, the agency operations. The next bar above that, it's in orange, is statewide operations, and that's a grab bag of spending by the state and that is not associated with any particular agency. And this year, the great bulk of statewide operations spending is to pay off the unfunded liabilities or to pay off on a long-term payoff plan, the unfunded liabilities of the public employees retirement system, the teachers retirement system, PERS and TERS. And the other portion of statewide operations spending this year is to pay off the state's bonds, or obviously this year's payment of the state's bonds. The third category right above that is capital spending. I think for this group, that's pretty self-explanatory. You'll notice that has changed the most over time, and it's way small now. A lot of people would say too small. And the light yellow on the top, starting in 1982, are Permafend dividend payments, which have been paid every year since the program started in 1982, and obviously have varied a lot as well. Now let's go to spending this year. Yes.
Can you go back to you can stay here on this slide. There's a question in the chat box.
General.
Does the 43% cut you described include the capital budget? And
yes.
What is the reduction in the operating budget?
It's substantial and we're getting there. Let me go through this and we'll get there. Both the capital and operating budgets have fallen. Let me show you this graphic of what's in the budget, and the next slide will show that. Okay. This slide shows what's in the budget this year, and it comes from the Alaska Legislative Finance Division. They call it their swoop graph. And so it shows by agency or category, like where the spending goes. From education, early development on the left-hand side to commerce on the right-hand side. And you can see that some departments get way more money than others. So two or three other things to note about this graphic is, one has been recently publicized, but I've known for a while, that the state of Alaska spends substantially more money now on corrections than it does in the University of Alaska. Another thing to note is that some departments are very, very small, obviously. Commerce department Department of Environmental Conservation are really tiny. Whereas on the left-hand side, the top 6 categories, education, early development, health and human services, Permafend, Dividend, statewide items, which I just explained, corrections, University of Alaska, represent in total over 80% of the budget. So if there've already been substantial budget cuts, but if there are going to be more budget cuts, they're going to come out of the left-hand side because, as the famous bank robber Willie Sutton once said, that's where the money is. So that's an important thing to understand where future budget cuts will come, if they do. So this graphic gets to agency operations and capital budget reductions from fiscal year 2015 through fiscal year 21, and it shows where the budget cuts have occurred. And the questioner is absolutely right. As a dollar matter and a percentage matter, the dollar matter is on the left, the budget cuts in millions. On the right are budget cuts in percentage. And as I said, the questioner is right in the thrust of the question. The capital budget has had both the largest total dollar reduction and the total percentage reduction. But there have been some other heavy, substantial cuts as well. I don't think I need to tell this audience that the University of Alaska's budget has been cut substantially. That has the next dollar cut and a very heavy, substantial percentage cut as well. Department of Commerce has been cut very substantially. 93% is, but it obviously started from a lower baseline, but could be cut by 93%. Department of Labor and Workforce Development, 73%. Department of Environmental Conservation, 69%. And even some of the other departments that are larger and didn't get much cuts got some. Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education and Early Development. I would note something else that a close-eyed viewer would notice. The one department that's not on here is the Department of Corrections, and that's because the Department of Corrections budget has gone up since 2015. That helps explain, along with the cuts in the University of Alaska, why we're spending more on Department of Corrections than we are on the University of Alaska today. So that's where the budget cuts have come from in recent years.
Cliff, can we pause here?
Sure.
I just wanted to give everyone the chance to ask a question if they had any. We have quite a number of participants. Do we have any questions up to this point?
Jomo, I have a question. This is Gary.
Hi, Gary.
Please.
So if you took the 43% and you separated it, it would be capital by some percent and operating by some percent.
Right.
What would those numbers be, Cliff?
I don't have that right off the top of my head. I have it broken down more. Capital's taken a substantial hit. University of Alaska's taken a substantial hit. In terms of you can just see by the dollars, right? But if you add up all the dollars, I'm just adding them up, in my eyes, I can tell that the operating budget has taken a substantially more larger, there are more cuts in the operating budget by dollars than the capital budget, right? You can, again, easily add up that that's, and from a pure dollar matter, I don't know what's the percentage matter what that would have been. The capital budget's been cut a lot. Other departments have been cut very substantially as well.
I would just respectfully suggest that when people roll out that number about how the budget has been cut over X years, that really be separated into two different components, because they are definitely different considerations and different dollars. And we try to conflate those and we get all confused. So if just a suggestion, then we can.
Sure, and I will do that in the future, Gary, but I know this is the UGF dollars, is your unrestricted general fund dollars, right? For all the graphics that when I talk about the spending. So that would be how in the revenue. But so that's how that would work. Yeah.
Hey, Rich.
But I calculate that.
Actually, yes, go ahead and jump back, Cliff. So I see, Rich, you've taken yourself off mute.
Yeah, I just wondered, is corrections the only department that has had an increase?
That's a good question. When I add it up, I don't know. I'll look at it. I know that it definitely had an increase. You can see, I think we're almost, it's got to be either the only one or one of the very few, because you can see how many departments are on this list, right?
Yeah.
So
I can't tell what's
Yeah,
not
I'll
on the
look that
list. I mean,
I know how many,
not on the list.
I know how many
On the
departments.
list.
I know how many departments there are, and we look like we've covered all of them on this page. But I'll look that up. Okay.
Mr. Davies.
Yeah, so I just want to make a quick comment on Gary Wilkins' comment. Gary, I agree with you that we need to have that number, and it's important to have it. They aren't different dollars, though. It's money's fungible. It comes out of the budget, and the cuts in capital budgets are significant. I mean they impact jobs in the state of Alaska. They impact our ability to maintain our infrastructure. So that the capital budget cuts are I know that's where we go when we have restricted income and budget challenges, but it's not sustainable to maintain the tiny capital budget that we have right now.
John, this is Gary. I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
I often say that experts often agree the capital budget is too small, and now we've just had two of them on this very phone call, other than me. Thank you, two former legislators.
Now we have one further question, Cliff, from Mr. Bruce
Sure.
Campbell. Does the cut include the PFD?
The dividends are lower than they were, right? Well, the dividends there's a formula that's a statutory formula that I'm very familiar with because I worked by far the most in the legislation that created it. It's been slightly changed in the 80s after that initial bill got passed that created the dividend, the per capita dividend we have today. But no, that's not on this list. But it's clear that, I'll go back and show you the dividend is a little different because it's on a formula. But obviously, the last few years, due to actions by the legislature and the governor, the dividend is substantially smaller than it was, than it would have been under the statutory formula. Or put another way, the last year the statutory formula was followed was 2015. Starting in 2016, we have not followed the statutory formula, right? And dividends have been lower than they would have been in the statutory formula. So I guess I would compare when you say cut, there's no statutory, others, departments don't have what I would call a statutory formula, or generally don't. So I think that's the sort of more relevant comparison. But it's absolutely clear the dividends have been cut from what they otherwise be starting in 2015. So they have had substantial cuts as well.
Okay, thanks, Cliff.
So Peter drew a card. Yes, sir?
No, I just said thank you.
And
all right, you're welcome.
Thank you. If I may jump in, this is Clark, and I don't want to interrupt Cliff because he wants to deliver, but this is the right time to ask a tiny nuance. I'm a transportation guy. On your chart right there, the transportation indicates that it's been, dramatically reduced. Do you have a sense? My personal impression is that that's, I'll say, not capital, it's maintenance. It's improvement sort of stuff too. So in a way, it's kind of capital of whether or not we, DOT, and can reach out and do some improvements and proper maintenance. But we've only closed down 5 stations out of 83, I think. So 50. Do you have a sense? See, so this is tiny, of where that 57% came from? 100, 200.
I know that some of it's the marine highway system, but my perception is, or my understanding is, that some from surface transportation as well.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm oblivious. You're correct. Yeah, that's an explanation. Yes, and it's
some also from surface transportation as well. I believe as well.
Yeah, because you and I, we know we've continued the match, thank goodness, and that's brought in billions. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Cliff.
Sure, no problem. Thank you, Clark. So Peter Dunlap-Scholl drew a cartoon about this. I would note that Peter owns a dachshund, and so that or among the dogs he owns, and so his point is that Alaska lacks. Well, sometimes it said the fiscal horsepower. He would say the fiscal dog power to carry the big basket that Alaskans expect, in terms of the University of Alaska roads, public safety. You could obviously throw in healthcare and K through 12 education there as well. So now let's switch to savings. And so this goes from 2005 to 2021. And along with budget cuts, we've had substantial spending of savings, very heavy spending of savings outside the permanent fund. And the savings balances, which this graphic shows going from, as I said, from 2005 to 2021, shows what's happened to our savings. Now, I'll start at the top. We used to, in the black and gray bars, we used to have, billions of dollars, more than $5 billion in the statutory budget reserve. That now has as many dollars as I, have Major League Batting championships. That would be zero. And because we spent all the statutory budget reserve dollars, and there's nothing in it anymore. We used to have a very healthy constitutional budget reserve fund that had well over $10 billion in it. But now we're down below $1 billion because we spent so much of the savings. So we spent some other savings in particular have been hit very hard. And we just have way less savings and not much outside the permanent fund, a principal and permanent fund earnings reserve account today. That's why there's so much pressure on the permanent fund permanent fund earnings reserve account. Peter drew a cartoon about this as well. So now let's talk about where most of the money comes from today in the budget. Basically, 2 out of every $3 in UGF revenues comes from the permanent fund earnings reserve account through a system called, as I said before, percent of market value system, or PMV system, that was established by the legislature and the statutes adopted in 2018. So much contrary to everything I have lived in Alaska hearing for so many years, Alaska is no longer an oil state when it comes to our fiscal system, the way we collect, spend, and save money. Alaska is now an endowment state, but there's several problems with that. The endowment's not large enough to support a reasonable budget, it would appear, without new revenues. We can easily overspend the endowment unsustainably because it's not in the Constitution and it's in the statutes. We could also even hit a bad market patch that would not allow us to draw the money under the sustainable PMV plan. So we have several problems with the system as it exists today. So now let's go to sort of the politics of where we are with this. So we'll start out.
Cliff,
yes.
do you mind holding on just 1 second?
Sure.
978-982-6931. We have someone on the phone. You've taken yourself off mute. Do you have a question?
Oh.
Nope. Okay. Carry on, sir.
Okay. No problem. So let's talk about some other things about Alaska exceptionalism. Alaska clearly has the tallest mountain in our country and by far the most miles of coastline, and the coldest temperatures ever recorded, in our country. But the more relevant features of Alaska exceptionalism are that right now are that we have every other state has either an income tax or a statewide sales tax, and almost 75% of the states have both an income tax and a statewide sales tax. Alaska, of course, thanks in part to my work, also has the world's only permanent fund dividend. And what we have now, and although we have one of the smallest populations of any state, we have uniquely complicated fiscal politics. Our fiscal politics, in my view, are the most complicated in the country. Illinois, New York, California, Texas, Florida all have way bigger populations, but they don't have as many sides in their politics. In other states, you tend to have like 2 sides. In Alaska, because of the existence of the permanent fund dividend, the permanent fund, and to some extent oil taxes, you really have 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. And so I call this the Groh matrix. Peter drew a cartoon about this. And it's really based in Alaska on what you fear the most. And that tends to drive you a certain way. And that helps make our politics more complicated. Some people are more afraid of additional budget cuts. Some people are most afraid of having broad-based taxes come back, particularly a graduated income tax that Alaska used to have from 1949 to 1980. Some Alaskans are most afraid of changes in the, some Alaskans are most afraid of cuts to local government or to cuts in the Permafend dividends below the statutory baseline. Some Alaskans are afraid of a way more continuing economic recession or a crash. And the complicated nature of Alaska politics and all the sides involved has helped stop and prevent a realistic fix of our fiscal crisis in paying for the public services Alaskans rely on. We also have been slowed down by blind hope and some fantasies. I've lived in Alaska all my life, and if I had $10 for every time I heard of some simple, easy solution to our fiscal crisis, I could take my wife on a very, very nice vacation to Hawaii. Because people say, Cliff, it's just easy to put in small budget cuts or easy budget cuts. People have told me, Cliff, there's all this natural gas on Alaska's North Slope. We're going to commercialize it or monetize it through a gas line or shipping it off the North Slope directly. I'll just tell you, folks, and I've worked in this area, I think that the prospects of commercializing Alaska's natural gas in a large scale way that brings money to substantial revenues to the state were probably closer to reality 15 years ago than they are today. Others have said, Cliff, all we need to do is open up ANWR. Well, the Trump administration did that in its 9 days, sold some leases. You saw what the response was. Some people have said, Cliff, we're just going to have all kinds of more oil development. There was a very experienced and distinguished Alaskan who told me that one particular prospect a few years ago was going to save us. And then a month later, that prospect closed down. And I met several people who lost their jobs. And I just think that is, we're just not going to see another Prudhoe Bay to save us. And that, betting on that is sort of like betting on me being the MVP of the NBA Finals. And then more recently, I've heard people say, Cliff, we're going to get a giant Alaska-only bailout from Congress, that Congress will appropriate a very, very substantial money for Alaska only. And that's, you know, given the existence of the Permafend in particular, that's the odds of that are about as is seeing me don a cape and fly from Anchorage to Fairbanks. I just think that it's important for us to understand that this is Alaska's problem and Alaskans have to handle it. And there's no easy external savior that's going to fly in and save us. So let's talk about what I think needs to occur to actually address this. I think there's some necessary steps. The first thing is to understand the scale. And the Legislative Finance Division would say, as pointed out in the most recent analysis, is that the state of Alaska has a structural fiscal deficit of $1.4 billion a year or more each year, every year, as far as the eye can see, under the current laws we have today. Second, we need to ditch the magical thinking, which I just talked about. Third, we need to see the big picture over time. We can't just talk about what it takes to get through this legislative session or this legislature and get past the next election. I'm hoping that we will all see that Alaska is going to last a lot longer. The state of Alaska will last a lot longer than just this year, or up until November of 2022. We have to see the big picture over a more realistic and time horizon. And finally, we need to confront what I call the identity questions of who pays and who stays. Somebody's going to pay to fix this very substantial structural fiscal deficit. And the question is, who's going to do it? And some of the more powerful Alaskans seem to be mostly motivated by trying to put off the day that the structural deficit is fixed until they can leave the state. And I think that is one of the unfortunate truths about our reality today here in our state. So folks, you asked me for plans. I got 9 plans that I've heard about. I try to collect them. And so I made a list of them, of every plan that I've heard recently and over the years to address Alaska's very big structural fiscal deficit. One plan I've heard of legislation, I called it this way, is to spend the savings unsustainably. That That's been the appears from the plan recently. Some legislators have talked about, well, we're going to have to keep doing that for a while. And I have questions about each of these plans. Is the plan, if after all the Permafend earnings reserve account is spent, is the plan then to go to the people of Alaska and ask them to approve a constitutional amendment to allow the spending of the Permafend principal? Another suggestion I've heard is to have budget cuts only. And whenever I hear that, I say, okay, we've had substantial budget cuts. What specific other budget cuts do you propose? And I will say that in 2019, when Governor Dunleavy proposed in February 2019 his budget cuts that would not have solved the entire problem, but would have gone a substantial way for it, his home school district, the Madison School District, said that adoption of the proposed budget of Governor Dunleavy would result in having 55 students in some classrooms. And the school district politely pointed out that both their classrooms could not hold 55 students, couldn't fit 55 desks in there, and additionally, the fire marshal wouldn't allow you to have 55 students in those classrooms. So if you propose a budget cut only approach, you have to identify which budget cuts you want and talk about whether those proposed budget cuts that would necessary to address the problem by themselves would leave with Alaska that people want to live in. People also said, hey, maybe we can solve this problem through taxes only, the taxes that are broad-based. In Alaska, that usually means an income tax or a statewide sales tax. And you have to talk about how much money there is there. Senator Tom Begich has just introduced a bill, an income tax bill, that would raise $1.4 billion a year. That would be, most or all of the deficit. That would tax 5% of all the income in Alaska, and that would raise the 1.4 billion. I think that's probably better to look at as an actual point of what might get raised. The bill the Alaska House of Representatives passed in 2017 that failed in the Senate was an income tax bill that would have raised $700 million in a year. I guess my point is, when you talk about fixing this with taxes only, at least one part of it is you have to talk about how much can be raised by broad-based taxes. Others have said, hey, Cliff, we're going to fix this problem through taxes on industry only. And when you talk to them, what they usually mean or basically mean is taxes on the oil industry. And obviously we had a vote on that last year as a ballot measure. And the supporters said that they hoped it would raise $1 billion a year. I want to point out, and I'm someone who has been instrumental in raising oil taxes before in Alaska back in 1989. And I will say that was at the peak of Alaska oil production. There's a lot less oil to tax now, and that's just a fact. And it's not going to get a lot bigger, as I've shown before, and experts agree it's not. We're not going to get a lot more oil production to tax, substantially more than we have now. Then there's this proposal of a jumbo dividend now, raise hundreds of millions annually in other revenue sources in future years, starting soon, and then cut the dividends going forward. This is Governor Dunleavy's proposal. I still have a major question of what the other revenue sources mean. A lot of people have said that Governor Dunleavy's hope is that he can somehow get the legislature to force a statewide sales tax on him. That has not happened. But if you're going to have hundreds of $1 million coming in from other revenue sources, you of course need to identify what they are before you can pass them. Another proposal I've heard is to build a permanent fund up to $100 billion and live off the earnings. When you say that, you have to ask the question about how long does it take you to get to $100 billion? And I've heard estimates in terms of that target date of from 2028 to 2038. I know that 2038 is well over 15 years from now. That's a long time. And even 2028 is a number of years from now. It's obviously more than 5 years ago, for 5 years from now as well. If you do get to 100 billion, can you live off the earnings alone? And you have to think about that answer as well. Another proposal is to constitutionalize the POMV. You obviously heard a presentation. I was not there, but I've talked to Ian Lang a number of times. I'm actually going to testify later today at a hearing about a bill to do this. When that would be to put the restrictions on spending Permafend earnings that are currently in the statutes and put them in the Constitution. The earliest you could do that is we'll have to vote on it in the November 2022 general election. Obviously, a year and a half away. And the idea is that we would force other choices because constitutionalizing PMV will not get you more money. In the short run, it takes money away. And so people need to think about what the rest of the plan is going to be. Another proposal I heard about recently is to create a perpetual dividend fund to take the money that was not paid out in dividends starting in 2016. It's more than $6 billion, some so-called back dividend money, and also take a portion of the royalties stream and create a constitutionally protected fund that would exist only to pay Permafend dividends. Obviously, this is sort of like constitutionalizing PMV in that it's not a complete solution, but some people have said it's a necessary part of a total solution. You can, reasonable minds will differ about that. A final proposal that is not usually talked about this way, but some legislators favor, is to have this very substantial increase in shifting of responsibilities from the state government to local governments. Some local government officials sometimes call this shift and shaft, and to try to get local governments to take on a lot of responsibilities that the state government has now. There are constitutional issues in at least some of the categories of this because the state government has some constitutional responsibilities in the last constitution for some areas of government, functions of government. Additionally, my political question would be: are local government taxes more popular than state taxes? I know that there's some people on this call with responsibility experience on local government and state government.
Legislators.
And yeah, but so they can perhaps answer that question themselves. So I'm going to give one last plan, a 10th plan. I used to call this the Groh plan, but one of my friends said, "Hey, Cliff, you're not popular enough to have a plan named after yourself. You should call it the Alaska plan." So I took my friend's advice. So here's a plan that's comprehensive and it would work, right? In the sense that it would raise enough money to solve the problem. I think you should have a constitutional amendment to help keep the Permafend and the Permafend dividend permanent. I also think that means that, and it's important to say this, as someone who helped create the Permafend dividend, that would result in Permafend dividends that were paid, that were lower than what they'd be under the statutory formula that's still on the law books today. I think that you need to have a moderate oil tax increase. I don't think that there's $1 billion there to get, but there might be $200, $300, $400 million to get as part of the comprehensive solution, sometimes called a grand bargain. I think we need a broad-based tax like we used to have from 1949 to 1980. We had and I prefer the kind that we had back then, which is a graduated an income tax and one that was graduated. I paid it back when I was a young man. Not a lot, didn't make a lot of money when I was a young man. But I've known a lot of people who, and some of us who are with us and some who are not with us, who paid very substantial amounts back on the income tax, because they're rich people back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when this law was in effect. And I think we could have, and I personally, by the way, some people tell me, Cliff, they're not millionaires in Alaska, and I say, I'll not use the harsh word, I'll just say malarkey. I've met a number of millionaires in Alaska. I have had coffee with a surgeon who made $5.5 million in net income in 1 year and working in Alaska. And I've met, various other millionaires. So there are some high income people in Alaska. I think that's important to note. I think we need to maintain budget discipline, but I also think we need to recognize that there may be areas, and there appear to be areas in my view that we're not spending enough. I think that we should raise the capital budget. I think that's important. I also think that we should have pre-kindergarten education. I feel very lucky to have gone through the Anchorage School District, but I think that there are a lot of children to be helped if they had some earlier interventions. If there's overspending of the Permafend earning reserve account for 1 year, and I sometimes say this, if we're going to have a bridge of the Permafend earning reserve account, it's got to be a bridge to somewhere and not a bridge to nowhere. And you should adopt your tax measures simultaneously. And finally, I know I'm really going to be sounding like I'm spitting into the wind, or on this last one. I think this should happen this year. The delay hurts us. The plan we've had of spending the savings, the past 5 or 6 years, it's hurt us substantially. You continue to spend savings and trying to kick the can down the road. It's a very bad plan for Alaska. I'm easy to reach, cliff.groh@gmail.com. You can also look at my website at www.cliffgroh.org. And I'm happy to take your questions, more of your questions, fair, unfair, vicious, or kind.
Okay. Cliff, thank you very much. All right, everybody. We are nearing the top of the hour, but we still have time. So I would just invite anyone who has a question to go ahead and take themselves off mute and fire away. John Davies, I see you're off mute.
Yeah, I would just comment that I think Cliff's plan is not substantially different than the plan that the Fiscal Policy Caucus, which Gary Wilken and I were members back in the day, proposed. And I would suggest that, I haven't actually done the numbers, but I sent it back of the envelope. I propose that if we had done that, we would have a permanent fund dividend close to $100 billion today. And furthermore, I'd also like to point out that I agree that we need a statewide tax, but the important, among other things, one of the important differences between a sales tax and an income tax is that if we have a sales tax, we pay more money to the federal government than we would under an income tax. And it's on the order of $100 million a year.
Interesting. Gary?
Thanks, Jomo. Thank you, Cliff. Nice to see you again.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks for all your work. We could spend a whole bunch of time on this, many have, and you have too. But let me just ask, because others want to talk. If I ask you the question, Cliff, if you took $1 billion out of the earnings reserve for the next 5 years, every year, $1 billion, what would the effect be if you model that? What would be the effect on the earnings reserve, the permanent fund dividend check, and the corpus of the permanent fund? Everyone talks about unsustainability. Everyone talks about we're running out of money. Everyone has rubs their hands and tells how poor we are. And indeed, your presentation almost makes apologies for the fact of the extraordinary wealth that Alaska has and almost apologizes for it. I don't apologize for slide number 17 and slide 15 in the least. We should put that at the very beginning. But anyhow, let me just say, Cliff, I can tell you based on permanent fund corporation data they gave me in 2017, and then I'll be quiet. But if you ask me that question, I will tell you based on that data right there, which I think you've seen before from me, I will tell you that over 5 years, if you take $1 billion out, the amount of the permanent fund dividend check decreases 1.6%. The balance of the earnings reserve account the corpus increases from 46 billion to 53 billion. By the way, we're at 78 billion today. It increases over that period of 5 years, and the earnings reserve account doesn't start to deplete until beyond 2027. Now, this is a model put together, and it contemplates full dividend check starting at 23.85 and growing in 2018, and it assumes inflation proofing at 960 million a year. So when you ask a legislator, well, we're robbing the earnings reserve, we're robbing this and robbing that, you have to then complete the thought by saying, well, what does that do to the 3 pillars that are the measure of whether we're robbing or not? And I would just suggest that I offer my answer here, and I would be more than happy to share this again with you. But we shouldn't be apologizing for our wealth. We shouldn't be robbing from the families and small business that are producers in this state. We should be embracing our wealth because we are indeed one of the most wealthy sovereigns in the world, and we shouldn't apologize for that. And with that, I thank you for the time. It's always good to see you and
sure.
And for your work. Thank you.
I'll send my work to you, Gary, if you'll send me yours, so we can trade. We've emailed before, and I will happy to do it. I've done 3 publications on this. 12 pages, 39 pages, and 70 pages. And so I'm happy to look at what you've done. And I've obviously worked with you before. You were kind enough to present a last Common Ground event that I helped organize and did some emceeing. I think it's really critical to understand that, and I want to answer 2 questions here about that. first, as to wealth, obviously, and this goes to the earlier question, if we'd made different decisions in the 70s and 80s, we'd be even wealthier today, right? But that's sort of similar to saying that if Cliff Groh had done more push-ups in the 70s and 80s, he'd be a bigger, a stronger, fitter guy than he is today. The best I can do is, try to, exercise every day now that I do it. So we have to have a more forward-looking approach. As to sort of the effects on the savings, we're spending down the savings in the Alaska Legislative Finance Division's models show that we go through the, permanent fund earnings reserve, account, and it goes to zero, by 2030, right? In their latest projections, under current law. That strikes me as a bad outcome, And third, who would pay an income tax? I think that the people who can afford to pay, that would, include me, and I'm thinking a lot of other people on this call. And I want to stress again, Alaskans are the lowest tax people in the United States. And I understand, Gary, your point about, well, we're wealthy. Well, but we're not as wealthy as we could have been, and we have a fiscal system now that is leading us towards some people, saying, well, we're going to have to declare bankruptcy at the current rate. And I have to point out, wearing an old hat I used to wear, I've now taken retired status of the Bar Association, but a federal law does not permit a state to declare bankruptcy. Local governments can declare bankruptcy, but states can't. So I think it's important to understand that even if you have a lot of money, you can blow it. And we're on that trajectory now. And I think it's critical for people to understand that.
Mike Prox. Yep. Hey, Rep Prox, you've been off mute. And it's a good segue to a comment I think you made earlier.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the presentation, and I don't think we can quibble over a lot of the details because we have a serious problem to address. But we need to look at it a little differently. I think what's left out of not just this presentation, but the general discussion is that the ability of a sovereign to tax depends on the gross state product. And that has fallen, and we have to focus on building the gross state product, however we're going to do that. We missed an opportunity. For instance, the Pebble Mine, that got shut down by a bunch of zealots that were just thinking of one thing. But for the overall state, that was unfortunate because that would have increased the gross state product. And we need to focus on building things wherever we can. And even if it's a small thing, tourism, they say, doesn't pay money back to the state. Well, point taken. But it employs a number of people who otherwise would be drawing off of state resources for whatever, transfer payments, if you will. So we got to focus on the production end of this. And I think to Senator Wilkins' point, we need to realize that we are sitting on a bunch of money. That doesn't mean we can continue to blow it. We have to think about this, but we don't need to panic, which I think was his point, and that is well taken as well. And then we have to, there's a bunch of pieces to put together here, and we don't need to panic. We need to look at this serious, and we need to look at everything we can do to make more opportunities to develop whatever resources we have, and not focus on just turning Alaska into a great big park. And because we can't continue to have the state fund things. People, to some extent, whatever you tax, some people are going to vote with their feet, they're going to leave. And that's going to change the model going down the road. So we've got to look at it from a whole bunch of different ways. But thank you very much for your presentation.
Right. And I contributed to getting it, to reducing the income of at least one person who makes money in Alaska, because I fired my dentist. Not because he was bad with my teeth, but I found out my dentist lived in Utah and flew to Alaska for 34 weeks a year for 4 days a week. And he was amazed to explain that he paid taxes on the income he made in Alaska in Utah, but obviously zero in Alaska. And I said, well, thank you, dentist. You know, are a fine fellow who I think does a good job with my teeth. but I don't need to support that lifestyle. And I guess our current system is sort of set up for people to make money, to come into Alaska, make money, and leave. Either some who get claim residency and some don't.
Yep.
And I think that that's an important thing to understand. And that's a growing trend there's a whole bunch of people in certain fields. And it's not just oil field workers or commercial fishers, but includes a substantial number of professionals who are making substantial amounts of income in Alaska, in either intent to leave soon or who never established residency at all, like my former dentist, who I did get another dentist, by the way. I don't want you people to think that, I went without one. I found another one. My first question was, where do you live? And he gave me a good answer to that, and I kept him. So I see we're at a certain time. I'm going to defer to Jomo. People can happy to talk more, cliff.groh@gmail.com. And I want to give one last answer to a question of income sources. Alaska had an economy before oil came. It's going to continue to have an oil economy for a while. Some of that. It's going to have tourism. It'll have fishing. But I think it's hard for the state to engineer an entire different economy. And we've spent a lot of money in various ways trying to do that. In some ways that haven't worked. And I understand what Representative Pratt said. Maybe that more mining can help us as well. But it's difficult for the state to manufacture an economy. And we've spent, as I said, substantial amounts of money. The state has to try to do that. And in some ways, you could drive around Alaska and look up some monuments of some things that have heard evidence of how that has not worked. So, Joe, I'm going to leave this to you now. What we do.
Okay. Well, we are at 9:03, but I do see that Bruce Campbell had just. There you are, Bruce. Do you have a question? I see that you had taken or put your camera on. You're on mute, Bruce. You're on mute, Bruce. You're on mute, Bruce. There you go.
Thanks, Cliff. Great presentation. I think the key piece I'd like to see in more of these is a more detailed analysis of the Alaskan economy and what the revenue sources might be, so that one clearly can say, okay, we're going to tax X, Y, and Z, and that will generate Q dollars. And that gives you a longer term budget sense of how this is going to work out. Because my concern is that you're really taxing the wealthiest group, which is in fact you and I, the retired state employees who retired on their high 3, and the bulk of whom may be in Arizona, and we'll get to tax all of that. That's nice, but what is the tax rate for public employees to pay for their own wage? Who else besides public employees is in the productive part of this economy? And the service sector just passes that cost on. What is the tax basis? Yes, we had a tax once before. That's not enough. We need to know who's going to get taxed and where it is. And it's not a hard question, but it does take a bit of an honest analysis of the economy of Alaska.
Right. And all I want to point out is Alaska got an income tax in 1949 when we were a territory. It was a critical thing in showing Congress that we could afford to support ourselves, that we would not just be a ward. Obviously, 1949 was decades before the pipeline opened up, and almost about 20 years before Prudhoe Bay got discovered. So, and the people of Alaska, people I knew and grew up with, and then me as a young man, paid taxes when we were not rolling in dough, right? And we're the lowest tax people in the United States, as I keep saying. And I think it's a little weird dichotomy to say, well, we have all this money, but then we can't afford to, but the money we have is not, under our current system, enough to support a budget that Alaskans agree that is useful. And, there are, I know you said that the service sector passes it on. There's a whole bunch of money being made in the service sector in Alaska today by surgeons, specialty physicians, dentists, other kinds of doctors, also some lawyers, a field I used to be in. as well as by people who work in the oil fields, who manage companies. There is a substantial amount of money being made in Alaska today. And people need to think about that real clearly about what kind of government and what kind of services we're going to have, like with roads and schools, as I said. Joe, I may have pushed beyond your patience.
No, you're doing great. You're doing great. I'm allowed to stay here with this happening as long as this gentleman to my left allows it, and he's not yelling at me. So I'll just make an observation, and I could be wrong. But in my perception, historically, we may not be the same people we used to be, we humans. But for a long time, people would pitch in and endure some pretty intensive discomfort as long as they knew that everyone was in the boat. The example that comes to mind is World War II, when there was widespread rationing to support the troops. And people used less sugar and figured out how to make hamburgers with some oats mixed in to stretch it out. I believe that we will have the best likelihood of solving this conundrum when we disallow people to be held harmless. If everybody pitches in something, we're much more likely to get to a solution than if we leave a door open to not contribute, because people will inexorably flee towards that open door, or they'll have that open door to point at for why they shouldn't have to contribute because someone else isn't.
I guess I give two responses to that. Maybe they're the same one. I guess we've gone from sort of a snowdrift culture to a Palm Springs culture. It's, I guess, to coin a term today. When I was a boy and a young man, there was more snow. We've had a lot of snow this winter in both Anchorage and Fairbanks. But when I was a boy and a young man growing up here in Anchorage, there was more snow and less snow plowing and way less four-wheel drive vehicles. So there was more of a culture, Jomo, sort of like what you're saying about World War II, that, and both, I would point out, Jomo, that unless you have a really good surgeon, you and I are both, neither of us are old enough to remember World War II. I know I'm not. I don't think you were either. So I just want to point that out. But I do remember late 50s, 60s, 70s, that people used to push each other out of snowdrifts more. And not just your friends and neighbors, but sort of more strangers too. You know, you help push a stranger out, they help push you out. Because like I said, people got stuck in snowdrifts more with more snow, less snow plowing, and the less four-wheel drive. And now when I go around and talk to Alaskans, particularly some powerful Alaskans, I've done this for decades. When I say we need to sacrifice now to make for a better Alaska in 5 or 10 years, the sort of silent reaction I get from some of them is, dude, I'm going to be in Palm Springs in a gated community, on the golf course in 5 years. I've already bought my condo. And I think that that's a different culture now. And one of the aspects of the problem, we need more snowdrift and sort of less golf courses and includes community thinking. That'd be one of my cultural prescriptions for our state. And I want to say one of the practical political sense. Another legislator brought this up to me and said, hey, Cliff, I'm worried about, some Alaskans paying and some not. That's an argument for having a head tax as well as an income tax. A head tax at a modest amount would get every Alaskan who worked to pay. Or maybe even, and I think that that's a useful thing to think about. But I do think that in my lifetime in Alaska, we've gotten a lot more focused on sort of divisions in trying to make sure that, I'm doing slightly better than my neighbor or somebody else across the state who I think is doing slightly better. And then less on how can we do to help us, like when I was a boy, it was more like, hey, we're out here a long way off from the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And we're sort of stuck out here in a land that's really hard to get to. And we have to sort of work together to help each other, like I said, and push each other out of snowdrifts.
Jim?
Yeah, well, Cliff, and everybody participating in this conversation, thank you. Obviously, the components of a solution were in this discussion. And you know, particularly Bruce, I appreciate your comments. You know, that we need to spend some more time, you know, gathering information and putting it into the equation. I think the important thing here, and probably all of you have talked about it a little bit, is that, you know, Alaskans see a need for a solution. And if we take those ideas that maybe we've harbored for, you know, a long time and worked on them, and just because we've worked on them for a long time, sometimes we think they're great ideas, and just put everything back on the table, we can collectively find a solution here. So thank all of you for participating in this. Cliff, we appreciate your time and your insight and your information. So
thank you, sir.
Everybody have a great day. We'll see you.
Thank you, sir.
Down the road.
Before everybody tunes off, hey John, before everybody tunes off, so two things, just letting everyone know we will not be having a meeting next week. So I just want to let you know, again, you're going to get the week off next week. And just so you know, we are going to, I see Miss Julia Nelica, you see here on the screen. She's our project manager, and she's in charge of Emerging Arctic. We talked about it several weeks ago. We had the Wilson Center, if you remember, regarding their Arctic infrastructure database. We are going to begin working on that project in earnest starting in May. And what that means is, again, they already have the Arctic infrastructure database structure set up. They already have a few projects for our community on that list, but we would like to help the Wilson Center flesh out that infrastructure list, with the understanding that from the Wilson Center, again, it was originally from Guggenheim Investments. It was originally designed to be essentially a warehouse of potential investment opportunities. And the Wilson Center believes it may still act in that fashion moving forward. And so, of course, we'd like to have as much opportunity represented on that database that we possibly can. So again, just know that we'll be reaching out to you. We may use a couple of the actual energy meetings for it, but we'll probably carve it off and maybe have some off-schedule meetings. But again, we know our town, and so we should help the Wilson Center properly reflect our town and its opportunities on its database. Okay. All right. Well, that's it, everybody. Again, thank you very much. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday and a great week to follow. And again, thanks a million, Cliff. Great discussion.
Thank you, Jomo. Thank you both.